So when I was a kid, I loved basketball. It was just a short period of time of my life, but it was everything to me. I loved basketball so much. All of my friends loved basketball. We spent a ton of time talking about basketball, watching basketball. And this would have been back when Jordan was in his heyday. So I loved watching Michael Jordan play. I mean, if the Chicago Bulls were playing and we got the game here in Chambersburg, I was watching it. So, I mean, there was a season where after school, all I did was play basketball. During recess, all I did was play basketball. I was on a basketball team at school, and so much of my life was just centered around basketball. Well, when I went to middle school, this would have been back when Chambersburg only had a single middle school, so all 600 kids of the school district get funneled into a single school, and when that happens, opportunity kind of shrinks down a little bit, because you can't have the amount of guys coming into the school district that are able to fit on a single basketball team. So they had to have tryouts. And when we get into this place now where we have tryouts, I was excited because I love basketball. So much of my life was basketball. So I worked hard, I was practicing, I was trying to get ready for this, and then the tryout came and went, and a few days later, I get a phone call and I didn't make the team. It crushed me because so much of my life was revolving around basketball. Even to the point where my friends who made the team now were no longer really my friends, because they were playing basketball and I wasn't playing basketball. And so I began to struggle with this idea of who I was. I began to struggle with this idea of value, because my whole life was centered around basketball up to this point, and now basketball was gone. And so I really struggled with value, even as a middle school kid, trying to figure out, where is it that I fit? What makes me important? And so, this morning, we are starting off a brand new series called Code of Honor. And this whole series is a discussion on value. It's a discussion talking about where we find our value and how we should show other people that we value them. The name Code of Honor is a little bit of a play on words, because every single one of us is made in the image of God. Some might say we are coded to be image bearers of God. Every one of us has that in our DNA, has that as part of who we are. But then on top of that, we are all called to live by a code of recognizing that in other people, because every single person has value, because they are made in the image of God. Mankind has had a pretty challenging history of devaluing each other. We've created so many artificial distinctions in the world, whether it's something from race or economic status or nationality, or all of these things that have been used to separate people, devalue some, and raise up others. So now, this act of being exclusive creates a false metric of value, meaning that when we push other people out and assign this value to them, we've got this false metric. Everybody believes and follows this thing that isn't necessarily true. See, every one of us wants to be loved. Every one of us wants to be accepted. Everybody wants to feel like they have value. And when we are left out, when we are excluded, naturally, we feel like we don't have value. One of the strongest ways for us to show other people and to ourselves also understand that we have value is when we realize that we're included, when we have the opportunity to be included. Think with me for a moment about times in your life when you were excluded from something. All of us have this, whether it's through a relationship or a sports team like I just said, or maybe it's a job or whatever. Every one of us has been excluded at some point, right? Think about all the emotions that went through your head when that happened. Think about the way you felt. Maybe you were excluded because of your abilities. Maybe you were excluded because of existing friendships, or perhaps non-existing friendships. You didn't know the right people. Maybe it was something you did. Maybe it was something that was completely outside of your control. When I was, a few years ago, I took my daughters, my whole family, we went to Hershey Park. And my three girls are kind of in nice steps of age, and size also has to do with that as well. So each one of them was in one of those different categories. You know, Hershey Park does like the candy bars and stuff, and that's how they judge your height to say whether it's safe for you to be on a ride or not. And so all three of my girls were actually in different height categories, and the youngest one, Emma, was actually right on the verge of getting into the next one. I mean, so much so that most of the rides that we tried to go on that day, she was allowed to, because she was right at the line, and they'd be like, oh, you're there, go on in. And so we went on ride after ride after ride, and eventually we ended up at the base of the ride that's called Tidal Force. That's the big ride that's like a giant boat roller coaster thing that drops down into the water and splashes it all over the place. And so as you're watching, you can actually get hit with these waves, and when you're on it, it's a bunch of fun. And so the girls are there with me, and at the time, they're probably, I bet you she was 3, and then my next one up would have been 5, and then the next one up would have been 7. So the 3 of them were like excited and bouncing up and down, and every time the water would splash, they're giggling and jumping around, and they're finally like, can we go on this? So we look at the height restrictions, and they're all there, at least based off of what we've been doing all day. So along with some friends of ours and their daughter, we get in line, and we go through this wait for like 15, 20 minutes. We finally get up to the place where it's time for us to get up there, and the whole time this excitement's building, because the kids are watching the splash, and every time they're like, oh, we're going to do that. It's going to be so much fun. And we go to get on the ride, and the guy operating the ride looks at Emma and like waves him over. And so she comes over, and he pulls out the measuring stick they use, and he's like, no, she's not riding this. And so I watched this little girl's face go from super excited to concerned to completely disappointed. And she's in tears as I'm walking her to the exit, and the other girls are riding with our friends that we were with. And she was so disappointed because she was being left out for a reason that she couldn't control, her height. And the crazy thing about it was, and what I realized later, because it was a water ride, we took her shoes off, and that's the thing that made her just too short to ride the ride. So any one of us can kind of relate to that situation of what it feels like to be excluded, what it feels like to be left out of something. But so often, those things that we're excluded from are significantly more serious than just an amusement park ride. Sometimes we're excluded from things that can be completely life-altering. Maybe we've been passed up for a promotion or a job, or maybe we've been laid off, things completely outside of our control. Maybe we've been struggling to fit in with the people that we find ourselves around every day. So we just kind of show up and we go through the motions, but we're never really part of the group. Maybe we're a parent. Young parents especially feel this tension of being excluded because they've got this kid and they've got to work around the schedule of the kids, but everyone else around them looks like they're out having fun when they're stuck, and nobody can seem to make time for that. Maybe it's because you're single and all of your friends and everyone around you seems like they're dating or married or there's some sort of coupling, so it makes it even harder then to get connected with them. Being excluded shows up in so many different ways in our lives. And when we allow those things to be the center of who we are, it can naturally impact the way in which we feel valued. I think sometimes, too, Christians can be a bit exclusive. Sometimes we create false barriers that keep people at arm's length, and in some ways becomes this evaluation of who they are and their value. We use things like history or background. We use things like lifestyle, and sometimes we create this false barrier and don't allow people in and don't welcome people and let them see Jesus because we've got this false representation of somebody's value tied to their past or their lifestyle. When in reality, Jesus is the only one who's going to be able to redeem that past, to transform that lifestyle. Today, we're going to be looking at how our value is not tied to being included or accepted. But we're also going to talk about kind of a flip of the script there about how when we include other people, when we allow other people to be a part of what we do, we can show them that they have value. And that value is not contingent on them being included, but is because they are created in the image of God. And that regardless of where we come from, Jesus loves us, every single one of us. And we need to affirm that value in every person that we come in contact with, especially when we have a relationship with Jesus. Because if we know who Jesus is, we need to be able to recognize the value in every single person. This week, we're starting this discussion in Code of Honor. We're going to be unpacking these things through every week, where we're looking at moments in David's life and his relationships and how honor shows up and how value shows up in those contexts. And today, we're going to be talking more about this importance of including people, of allowing people to see their value by inviting them to the party, by allowing them to be a part of what we're doing. To start this series off, we're actually looking at a story that many of us are pretty familiar with. We're looking at the story of David and Goliath. And so often, this has become a children's story for us. It's this story of the underdog, right? This story of this kid who faces off against a giant, and we make it really friendly for kids, and we work through that. But in reality, there's a lot more going on in this story, and in some ways, it's a little bit dark. But we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at how God honors David by allowing him to step up and be included whenever everyone else around him was not ready for that. So to understand what's going on in the story, we have to kind of look at the background that leads up to this story. See, Goliath was a Philistine, and the Philistines had this pretty long history of conflict with Israel. From the day Israel became a nation, the Philistines were kind of a thorn in their sides. They were constantly attacking the nation. They were constantly coming in, and there were times actually where they had completely oppressed the nation of Israel, and they had come in and they had kept them knocked down and occupied their land until God raises up a hero. Oftentimes they're called judges throughout the book of Judges, and those people would then kind of push the Philistines out, and this cycle kept happening over and over and over again. Well, eventually, Israel decides that they want a king, and so they raise up Saul to be king of Israel. And Saul then, as the king now, is running the kingdom of Israel, but he still has this problem with the Philistines. They still want to be there. They still want the land. They still want to take over. And in this story, we start off with the Philistine army in Judah, which is a part of the kingdom of Israel, and they are camped out, ready to fight. So Saul shows up with his army, and both armies are sitting on mountainsides over either side of this valley. And they're facing off with each other. And the Philistines send out their champion who issues a challenge to the people of Israel. This champion is Goliath. The Bible says this man was 9 feet tall. That is tall. That is a big dude. And beyond that, he is a seasoned warrior. So this monstrous warrior comes out between these two armies, and he issues this challenge. He says, if you can beat me in one-on-one combat, we'll surrender to you. But if we beat you, you're going to surrender to us. So he issues this ultimatum, and for 40 days, the people of Israel and King Saul are terrified. They won't step out, and they won't fight this guy. So for 40 days, these two armies are sitting across from each other, and every single day, Goliath comes out, and he makes the same challenge. And while he's making the challenge, he insults the people of God, and he insults God every step of the way. For 40 days, this is the situation. Well, with that stage set, then, we have to look at David, the other main character in this story, right? David is the youngest brother of 8 sons. So he is the youngest of all 8, and actually, the 3 oldest brothers are in Saul's army. They're in this whole mess, and they're on the Israelite side. 40 days of standing there watching this guy come out and insult them, and nobody moving a muscle to do anything about it. Well, David, prior to this, was actually just recently anointed king by God. And this is because King Saul was not obeying God, and he had actually actively gone against what God wanted from him. So Saul was being removed as king, at least his line was being removed as king. So God has anointed David to be the next king of Israel. Most people aren't aware of this. This is kind of happening behind the scenes. God has let this happen, but David's brothers are well aware of this because every single one of them were passed up, and the youngest one was the one chosen. So David, up to this point then, has been working for Saul. He's been working for King Saul as an armor bearer and as a musician, and so he would be in Saul's court and taking care of Saul and doing his duties there, but then he would also then go home and help take care of his father's sheep. So he had this kind of back and forth journey of his life. So this whole thing is going on, and David has not been a part of this face-off yet. But David's father sends him with some supplies to go and to take to his oldest brothers who are in the army. So David's dad said, take this food, take this grain, and give it to your brothers and give it to their commanders. So David is actually on his way to this fake battle thing that's going on, this back and forth, to deliver these supplies. And as he gets to the camp, he starts asking the soldiers, what is going on here? Why is nothing happening? Why is there no fight happening? And they start to explain what's going on with Goliath when Goliath himself comes out and issues the same challenge he's been issuing day after day after day. If you can beat me, we'll surrender. But you guys can't because you're weak, because your God isn't powerful, because this isn't real. Well, David is offended by this. In verse 26, he said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David is so offended by this guy's call out that he is there saying, "Who is this guy? We need to take him out." And he's being loud about it. In fact, so loud that his brother overhears him. And when his brother Eliab, his oldest brother, hears him, he angrily says to David, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see this battle." And David said, "What have I done? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away from him toward another, and he spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So Eliab, David's oldest brother, remember, he is living in this context of his brother has just been chosen to be king over him, right? So he's got all of this too. He sees David and he presumes that it's arrogance, and that's why he's coming out here. He thinks he's something special because God's going to make him king. So he's seeing this and going, "You're just a kid. Why would you be out here running your mouth? You don't know any better." And he excludes him from the conversation because of what he believes and what he sees. Well, eventually, David doesn't stop saying this. He keeps going around the army saying, "Why aren't we facing this guy?" And King Saul hears about it. So King Saul's like, "Hey, bring this guy in. I want to hear who it is that's brave enough to face off against Goliath," because they're all scared. They're all hiding. And David shows up and he's like, "Whoa, no, you're just a kid. It's not going to happen." See, at the time, David was probably somewhere around 15 to 18. He's not old enough to be in the army yet, but he's an older teenager. And this kid, perceivably, is the one who's running his mouth about, "We can beat this guy. Why aren't we fighting him?" He goes on and starts to make an argument to Saul to try and convince Saul to let him in. He says, "Man, I kill lions and bears to protect my sheep. God's allowed me to do these things. Why can't I take this?" And in verse 37, it says, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So finally, whenever David throws the credentials down of God is the one who is going to do this. God has already allowed me to do these things. He's going to let me do this as well. Saul gives in. It's like kind of the ultimate, "Put me in, coach. I can handle this. I can do this." And he says it from the perspective of, "I can do this because God's going to do it through me." Well, Goliath is this fully armed, 9-foot-tall man, and there's David, this 15 to 18-year-old kid, showing up with a sling and a staff. It doesn't look good, right? In fact, so much so that Goliath says to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." And David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of the hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and I will cut off your head." David does just that. In one shot, he kills Goliath with his sling, and then he uses Goliath's sword to cut his head off. And he gives God the credit when he does it. This whole story gives us a picture of the importance of honoring others, allowing them to step in, especially whenever God sees their value. David's rejected by his brothers. His brothers say, "Nah, you can't do this." He's rejected by King Saul. "Nope, you can't do this. You can't be included with this." And so it's not until God is the name that's brought into the conversation that David's able to step in. See, God honors David then by allowing him to have victory. God lets David be included by giving him this victory. Beyond all this too, David's the only one who's brave enough to face off out of this whole army. For 40 days, the army is scared. The king is scared. But David because he knows who God is, steps in. David's given the shot, even though on paper, this isn't going to be good. 9-foot tall guy who's been a warrior since he could walk, it seems, fully armed, versus a shepherd boy with a sling. God affirms David's value by helping him have victory. So what does this say to us in the here and now? What does this say to us today where we are in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, right? How does this help us to learn how to honor the people in our lives, to show them that they have value? How does this help us work through some of the value issues that we have in ourselves, especially when we've been left out? Well, let's look at that second question first. Notice, David doesn't back down when his brother or King Saul tell him that he's not going to be able to handle it. And you know why he doesn't back down? Because he recognizes his value comes from God, not from other people. This is one of those amazing struggles that every single one of us deals with in our day-to-day lives, because what we're talking about here is actually a conversation about identity. We are talking about the things in which we wrap our lives in apart from God. And these external things we often mistakenly tie to who we are, to our identity. These are things like our position or our job or any sort of role we have in our lives. We allow those things to become our identity. These are things like our relationships, whether we're a parent or a boyfriend or girlfriend or a husband, wife, or we're single or we're a good friend, right? We allow that to become the center of our identity. We let our hobbies become the center of our identity. We let our sexuality or our gender become the center of our identity. We allow our race to become the center of our identity. We allow our money and where we sit on the economic ladder to be our identity. But when our identity comes from those things, that's also then where we receive our value. And when those things fail us or are challenged, then we go through a major identity crisis because we aren't rooted in a strong foundation. When our identity instead comes from being an image bearer of God, we're being created by God, and the realization that God is the one who gives us value, not all this other stuff, then it shifts the entire way that we handle things like rejection and being excluded. When we recognize that God is the center of our identity, that we're first and foremost created in His image, our value comes from that relationship and not from outside and not from about how we look or who we know. We're going to be diving into this whole idea, this whole conversation a little bit more next week, but I think it's important for us to remember that our value is coded into us by God, and He values us to the point where He sent His Son to die for our sakes. That is like the ultimate expression of value. Romans 5:8 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. What that means is, while we did not even care that God existed, that we didn't even know we wanted a relationship with God, God stepped up and sent His Son to die for us. He sacrificed His Son in this ultimate expression of how much He values us, how much He cares about us, how much He loves us. When that becomes the source of our value, and that's where our identity is rooted, even though it can be challenging to be excluded from things, even though we can be pushed out of things, it becomes a blip on the radar instead of something that completely distracts and destroys our life. Timothy Keller is an author and a pastor in a large church in New York, and he's used this illustration multiple times in sermons and in his books, but he has two actors that go to his church. He has these two guys, and one of them was really growing in a relationship with God and Jesus, and the other one grew up in the church, but he was kind of drifting away. But both of these actors actually were able to audition for the same part. It was this big budget Hollywood movie, and they both auditioned, and neither of them got the part. The guy who had a relationship with Jesus recognized that that's not where his value came from. So when he did not get the part, he was okay. In fact, he went on to start a really successful business. And in that whole world, he was acting, he's been in movies, he's actually been in Broadway, he still lived out that stuff, but his value was not tied in whether he got that job or not. The other guy, though, his identity was 100% centered in being an actor. And when that didn't happen, he spiraled out of control. He was refusing to even try and take acting auditions. He was getting into some other stuff that was really destructive for his life. And even now, he's still kind of just floating through life. His life is completely derailed because his value was tied in something external instead of a relationship with God. When we understand that our relationship with God, that what God already assigned to us when he created us is where we find value, then we are able to handle so many other things, and that includes being excluded. That includes not being chosen. That includes not being connected. But that also leads to the other question. How do we show other people that they have value? How do we honor other people? Show them that they have value. See, we need to learn to understand that God creating us in his image is what gives us value to begin with. But the best way for us to come into that understanding, at least in the full, is whenever we have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Understanding that value starts with a relationship with Jesus. And so, as people who know Jesus, people who understand where our value comes from, we need to, in turn, be inclusive and let other people see that same value. We need to be willing to value every other person in the same way that we recognize we are valued. This also means then sharing Jesus with people. This means stepping out and letting people know that they are loved and that Christ died on the cross so that they can have abundant life. They just need to choose to follow him. And that leads to a pretty scary word that we use in the church called discipleship. This thing that we think is this really complicated process where we have to go to classes and we have to work through these things, which I'm not knocking those because classes and things can be really powerful for us to do those things. But discipleship is about inviting people to be a part of your life and showing them what it means to walk out a relationship with Jesus. That's what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have all these processes and all this other stuff, though they can be helpful. What it means is we need to live life together and continually show people the love of Jesus in their everyday lives. Loving the people around us in real tangible ways and letting them see who Jesus is the best way to show people how to have a relationship with him. And some of that might just be something small, like inviting them to join you when you come to church, inviting them to live that part of your life with you, bringing them alongside you so that they can hear more about who Jesus is, that they can experience what it means to be welcomed in a community that loves them because they know that God loves them, regardless of their past, regardless of their history. Let them see that they have value because God values them. This includes those people that are on the outskirts, the people on the fringes that oftentimes we struggle to come alongside. But loving people in small, tangible ways is the way that we're going to be able to help them understand that they have value. And that means refusing to play into this ridiculous framework that humanity has created. We can't play into these games of race and nationality and economic position and lifestyle and think that by excluding people based off of things like that we're going to express the love that Jesus has for us. We need to learn how to be welcoming. We need to learn how to love the people around us, regardless of any of those things, because we understand that God created every person with value. We can't look down on other people. We need to understand that God loves them the same as he loves us. You might have heard this sentiment, love the sinner, hate the sin, right? This idea that we need to love people regardless of the stuff that's in their lives. The only downside and problem with that sort of thing is that oftentimes we use that and we still look at people based off of their sin and not based off of the fact that they are created in the image of God. I think the heart behind it's right. I think we need to learn how to love people and not be concerned about the stuff that's in their lives, because the thing is, a relationship with Jesus is the only thing that's going to take hold of somebody's life and actually bring transformation, actually redeem their past, actually redeem these things that they are struggling with. Because we're not the ones that are going to change people's lives when it comes to sin. We're not the ones by pointing a finger that are going to be the ones that call that stuff out and bring this transformation. Now, granted, when people have a relationship with Jesus and we build relationships with them, that's a different story. We can help come alongside people and help people stay accountable because we're on the same page. We have the same frame of reference. And especially when we have a pre-existing relationship where we can speak into their lives, then we have the right to talk up. But when someone walks through the doors and they have never had a relationship with Jesus, we can't sit there and say, you can't be a part of this because of XYZ. It's not part of who we are. As followers of Jesus, we are called to be inclusive. We are called to bring people into a relationship with Jesus by letting them recognize that he loves them and that they have value. As we kind of wrap things up today, I have a challenge for you guys. I have something that I want you to be able to process today and throughout the course of this next week to be able to walk through. First off, think of the places in your life where you're trying to find value someplace other than God. This can be so many different things. And so often, I think we all have these blind spots in our lives where we can't see it. Because I know that there are plenty of times in my life where I look at something or I realize that something has taken a place in my life where it doesn't belong, where I'm getting my value from something other than Jesus. And when I know these things are happening, it's because someone usually pushes a button in my life and it derails me. And I realize, oh no, this thing had a lot more power in my life than I realized. But we need to take the time to examine our lives, allow God to speak into our life, to show us what those areas are. So I challenge you, spend time over the next few days. Try and find out and understand where those things are, and then make sure that you're loving the people around you in a tangible way that shows them that they have value. Think of at least one person that you interact with on a daily basis so that you can show them the love of Jesus in their day-to-day lives and recognize the value that God has for them. As we close this service, let's stand together. We're going to spend some time just singing one more song before we wrap everything up. But in the course of this song, I want you to continue to work through this stuff in your own heart, in your own lives. Don't let yourself be able to go, man, that was a good message, and then just move on. By all means, too, if you find yourself struggling with value, you find yourself struggling with where you are, please come talk to me. I want to be available to you that we can sit down, we can have a deeper conversation, maybe even grab a cup of coffee, whatever it needs to be, so that we can help you figure out what it means to take your next steps in a relationship with Jesus. Let's sing together as we close this service.